And of course we had the GI Bill, but I had been wounded, so I had a slightly different thing called Public Law 16. So I said, oh, I'll go to college. So I did.
Where'd you go?
University of Illinois.
Oh, nice.
And I'm a borderline dyslexic, so I did very poor in grammar school. I started to read in high school, but I didn't make great grades, except in natural science and shop.
Yeah.
But the Army, I think, taught me that I wasn't really dumb. It was just I had this reading problem, because, you know, dyslexics see things backwards and mixed up and so forth. But I gained confidence in the military. So I got into college, finished in 3 years, and graduated with high honors. My first grade teacher, when she heard about this, fell off her chair because she had labeled me as one of the dummies who could sit in the back of the room and draw. Probably wouldn't learn much.
That's funny. Okay, I'm just going to ask you to say your name and spell it, then give us your unit and your rank.
Okay, Warren, which is easy to spell, but Asa, A-S-A, is a name from Luxembourg. My great-great-grandfather came over in 1840, and I think we've had relatives in every war since then, except maybe the Spanish-American War. We might have missed that one. ASA, my unit was G86. What else was I supposed to say?
Your rank.
Rank. I never got above PFC. I came in at 18 and got out at 19, so didn't have much chance against the guys who had been in for a couple years before that. And I will speak up just a little bit because I'm slightly hard of hearing. I don't know if that's from too many machine guns and mortars or too many shop tools.
Okay, sure. So what was your first, were you at Camp Hale?
No, I missed Camp Hale. I was a Johnny-come-lately.
Okay, so start where you started in the war. Tell us about where you started.
Well, I knew I was going in the service because I was senior in high school in 44. And my brother had been in the Navy, and he said, oh, get in the Navy. We have good beds and good food until the ship sinks, and then you're on your own. So I tried for the Navy, and the Navy still had rather high standards for your eyes, and I couldn't pass the eye test. Of course, later on, the Navy took draftees with any kind of eyes. But anyway, if you volunteered, you had to go in the Army immediately, and I wanted to graduate from high school, because with my bad grades, I figured if I don't graduate now, I'll never graduate. So if you waited until you graduated, you had to go in the draft because, of course, we were already signed up. So I indeed was drafted, went to Great Lakes, Chicago, went to Camp Blanding, Florida. The highest spot on the whole Camp Blanding base was probably 50 feet above sea level. Had 19 weeks of basic training, which I thoroughly enjoyed because I was in very good physical shape. And I had fired a rifle a time or two, but didn't really know anything about weapons or explosives or booby traps, but I found it all fascinating. It was just a whole new world. And I didn't mind the discipline. I mean, military discipline is sort of odd, but I got by with it. But I thought being a replacement isn't really the best way to go. It's nice to be in a unit where you know people. Well, on the bulletin board, it had all sorts of stuff about join the paratroopers because they were training in Georgia and South Carolina and nearby Florida. But finally I saw this notice, the mountain troops. And I'd seen Life magazine's very brief articles about the 10th Mountain Division. I said, that's for me. So I discovered you had to, 1, volunteer, get 3 letters of recommendation, and write a letter telling about your outdoor background. Well, I lived in central Illinois, where we got some snow, but almost nobody skied because it was flat. But I knew what skis were because I had a friend who had a pair of skis, and he would occasionally ski to school. So I said, that's for me. And my best thing I could argue about was I'd done some winter camping, I was an Eagle Scout, liked the outdoors. So I think they were accepting everybody at that point. But anyway, I got in and I thought, this is wonderful. I'm going to train in the mountains. Well, I didn't go to Camp Hale. They had already moved to Camp Swift. So I went down and played around in the hot sun and then went overseas.
Okay. What was your time like in Camp Swift?
Time out in?
What was your time like in Camp Swift?
Actually, I had taken heavy weapons training and I was going to be in a rifle company. So they said, well, go out and practice on the rifle range because you haven't been firing your rifle much. You've been shooting machine guns and running stuff down mortars and so forth. So really, I remember mainly rifle range. I never worked with the mules and got in a unit with a real bunch of real fine NCOs and seemed to be good officers too. So I was very happy with G86.
Do you have any funny memories from your time at Camp Swift or even your time in basic training?
Not necessarily funny from Camp Swift. It was mainly getting acquainted and trying to fit into a new unit. Basic training is not a time for a lot of fun because you're working 18 hours a day and sergeants are screaming at you constantly. They don't want you to be a civilian anymore. They want you to be a military person. So I've got a lot of funny stuff from Italy, but not there.
Okay, so from Camp Swift, where did you go?
We went directly to Newport News, got on the USS Argentina. I think it was the whole 86th Regiment plus some other units that were returning. A lot of individual guys who had been in combat for 2 or 3 years, well, maybe 2 years, Africa and Italy, and got a couple-week furlough home. Very crowded on the ship, very little entertainment, but luckily our company was selected for guard duty. So we got to stand around in the hallways guarding the officers' quarters. From what, I'm not sure, but anyway, we guarded them. And you only got 2 meals a day on board the ship, and the meals weren't very good. I don't know who cooked them, but it was pretty hashy stuff. But usually it was 10th Mountain guys who were dishing them out. So you'd say, everybody was called Mac. You'd say, hey, Mac, slip me a couple more hard-boiled eggs. I'll have something to eat during the day, because it was going to be 10 hours till you ate again. And they'd usually slip you something. And then when we went on guard duty, usually we got a sandwich. So we came out all right.
What was it like joining the 86th after they'd had all the training at Camp Hale and had done all that stuff? What was it like joining them in Camp Swift as opposed to going missing all the bonding in Camp Hale? Well,
my biggest thing I was sorry about was missing all the mountain training, because that's what I thought, oh boy, I'm going to learn about rock climbing. I mean, we had climbed little cliffs in Illinois, but they were dirt cliffs, and even though some of them were rather difficult, it wasn't the same as really rock climbing. And I thought, oh, I'll learn to ski and I'll have some time in the real mountains, because the highest hill near where I lived in Illinois was 600 feet. It was a terminal moraine from a glacier, and we used to go up there and thought we were on top of the world. So I missed the mountain training, and that was really a sad thing for me to miss that.
Okay, so you're on the ship going to Italy. So what happens when you get off the ship?
We were in Naples, and Naples had been bombed by everybody, and then the Germans, before they left, sunk a whole lot of ships in the harbor. So it was a mess. And they'd built a little temporary dock so they could get trucks and troops could march off and so forth. But we had lived in this, I think it was Mussolini's old school or something. We slept on marble floors, which were pretty hard, but we had 4 blankets, so that was all right. But again, our company got guard duty, so we were out trying to guard this compound from all the street people, but the little kids had a way of crawling in through some gutters somehow or another. So they were in there shooting craps with the GIs. And then occasionally we would have guard duty outside the gates. And I was sort of a naive farm boy from Illinois, So these British trucks would come along, lorries as they called them, and girls 14, 15 years old with short skirts would be standing out in the street. And the British soldier would yell out, I want you, and here's a bag of candy. And the girl would say, great, and jump in. And I thought, what is exactly going on here? Then I learned they were prostitutes, and they were getting candy or something for the black market to feed their families. You grew up in a hurry when you got into places like that. And I thought I would learn Italian. And I thought, well, the way to learn a foreign language is just to memorize a whole lot of words. So I learned the directions, I learned up and down, I learned weights and measures, days of the week. And I discovered to learn a foreign language, you need verbs, you need action words. I couldn't say anything because all I knew were nouns and the names of things. So that was one of my first lessons in being in a foreign country.
Continue about the time in Italy. Tell us more about it. From your experiences going from Naples up to Riva Ridge.
Well, we went up on freighters, sort of reconverted freighters and small ships. But the funniest thing, and this is sort of a gross story, but they fed us on deck. I think the cook set up their field kitchens on the deck, and it was mainly just hash and stew and stuff. But you had your mess kit, so you're walking around the deck and there was no place to sit, so you're just trying to eat, and you had a canteen cup full of punch or something or other. The odd part was, and this is the gross part of it, they didn't have enough bathrooms, so to allow places to relieve themselves, they just had some planks that ran about maybe 15 feet out the sides of the ships. And it was just like a privy, just a bar that you sat on and relieved yourself. Well, if there was a little spray from that, it wasn't so bad, except when you were eating. So here you had your open mess kit, and somebody's out there relieving themselves, and some of this is flying back onto the deck, and you're saying, yike, this is a terrible place to be. I'll try to find a different spot out of the wind. I found that odd, unusual, and very unsanitary. But we got to Livorno, and then we did the standard stuff. We went up to the King's Hunting Lodge, I think it was, and we got up there sort of late. We went through Pisa, and we were in a covered canvas truck, and after I was wounded, I came back through Pisa in a covered ambulance. So I've been back to Italy, 3 or 4 times, but still never seen the Leaning Tower. But one sort of funny thing happened when we were at the hunting lodge. We got there late in the day, and everybody had I think we had pup tents, not the mountain tents. Anyway, we set them up everywhere. Just one company had this area, another company. And the next morning, this, of course, being a military operation, all the tents had to be in perfect alignment. Well, we didn't know how far we were from the front. We didn't know if the German Air Force was still operating, but we thought if the German Air Force strafes us at night, they've got these perfect tent rows with 2 guys in each tent. They'll kill everybody by just going zoom, zoom, zoom. So we tried to argue with the officers that we really thought the tent should be dispersed. No, that didn't work. Had to be in perfect alignment with a string.
So when you get off the train, you're at Riva Ridge?
I don't think we ever were on a train in Italy. Some of the units probably were. We were always on trucks.
Yeah, the truck.
And our unit got up to a little mountain town, which I actually think had been maybe a bit of a ski resort. I don't know if there was actually a tow or anything, but I think people actually had skied up there because all the buildings seemed to be bed and breakfast type places. And it was more or less on the front, but the Germans were on another hilltop 8-10 miles away. But we sent out patrols, they sent out patrols, and we often thought they had got into the village. I think it was Catigliano, but I'm not really sure of that name. And one night, somebody shot at what they thought was a German patrol. It turned out it was some young Italian Lothario coming home from visiting his girlfriend in the middle of the night, and they shot at him, but didn't shoot him, didn't hit him. And on one of our patrols, I don't think it might have been German gunfire, but I think it may have been a partisans. The partisans were always roaming around doing whatever they did, and they shot him, but he got 2 wounds on both buttocks, and they put a Band-Aid on each one. They just flesh wounds. Shot went right through his pants. So, and another funny thing happened there. We had an Italian lady who spoke very good English, and she was our official company interpreter. So Captain Faust would need her to interpret anything that happened. So this one man who lived in Catigliano came running into the company headquarters, which was in one of these B&Bs, and screaming and hollering. And so finally the lady told Captain Faust, the Germans sent a shell through his roof and it didn't explode, but it's laying in his bathtub. What can we do about this? So somebody went over and took the dud out of the bathtub. We often figured an awful lot of the German duds, they had prisoners of war or whoever, maybe conscript labor from the Netherlands or from France working in their factories. Well, of course, they figured if we can defuse this shell, it'll save some of our own people. But the Germans would inspect and they would see that this had been sabotaged, this shell. So they started torturing or disciplining the people who worked in the factory. But then they figured out a way that it would pass inspection, but the shell still wouldn't go off. So many times I was thankful that I had a dud land close to me and not a live shell.
What were your preparations like to go up Riva Ridge?
I didn't go up Riva Ridge.
Okay.
We were in reserve. The 86th did a lot of the fighting on Riva Ridge, but our company, one of the luck of the draw, we went up at night through the snowstorm, spent a whole day laying in a barn, and then the next day the units went up, and they had some fighting at the top, but they never called for all the reserves. So we had our worst, and then we didn't go up Belvedere either, but we had our worst day on March 3rd. And John Compton, whose parents were quite wealthy, they were involved with Ralston Purina. They've just given money for that bridge at Camp Hale. And in Italy, they helped a priest build a tall tower behind his church. And I have a little story to tell about that tower too. But he was killed that day. John Compton was his name. And he was killed around Iola. But that was a very bad day for G86 because we lost a lot of men.
Can you elaborate more on that? What was it like?
It was just bad. I mean, a lot of shelling, of course, a lot of small arms fire. And I had another funny story. Our unit, a lot of times different units would cross through another unit. They would go so far and then we'd pass through. Well, we made the mistake. We were up on this hilltop and some other guys were dug in and we were going to go through them. And we stopped and talked to them. Well, that was a bad thing to do because the German observers probably said, there must be a unit there. These guys are talking and stopping and talking. So we went down and there was a stream at the bottom and they started shelling this hillside right behind us and they hit that unit that was dug in up there and I'm sure they took casualties. But I'm right in the middle of this stream, not a huge stream, maybe 15 feet wide and 1.5 feet deep. I knew if I plopped down in the water to save myself from the shelling, I'd be wet, and we had no sleeping bags, no chance of building a fire or getting in a building. I knew I'd freeze that night. So I went into the push-up position where my arms only got wet up to here, and I had shoe packs on, so my feet didn't get very wet. So I spent the shelling on the push-up position in the middle of the stream. I thought that was funny.
Can we go back to March? What was your objective during all that?
I think we were trying to get to a little town which was right on a ridge, a knife-edge ridge, and the buildings were just one on this side of the road and one on that side for, I don't know, a quarter of a mile. And the thing was called Sassumalore. And my unusual story is we've been back to Italy twice on the return tours. And the first one was 82. And I couldn't figure out what happened to us on March 3rd. We were sort of in the area, but I never really got the feel for the ground. But in 91, we went back. My wife and I went back. The first time we had our 3 children with us. Went back in 91, and this old priest, who had been a young priest when we went through, and I think the town was Chrysocolla. We called it Coca-Cola, but I think the real name is Chrysocolla. He told the story that they always had a memorial mass, and everybody went. You didn't have to be Catholic. Anybody would go, and they all took communion too. But that was all right. Anyway, he said that he was on an airplane from somewhere in the north to Rome, and he was sitting next to an American fellow, and the American gentleman got to talking, and he said, I had a son killed in Italy, and I would like to do something, but I just have no plan of what I could possibly do. And this priest said, I've always wanted to build a tower behind my church. And this man, who was part of the Ralston-Perina group, he was John Compton's grandfather, I think, not father, but grandfather. He said, you build the tower, I'll pay for it. So he got an Italian architect. They built this nice 4-story tower behind the church on a little rise. And after this memorial mass, we were invited to all go up there. So somehow or another, I think I was giving badges or little pins to the young choir that had sung during the church service. But my wife and I got up there late, and we're up on the top, and it's maybe 15 by 15, and I'm looking around, and I see some cliffs, and I thought, that looks like where we jumped off. And then I saw this great sort of loop around, and I said, that looks like where we went. And then I saw this razor-shaped ridge, and I said, that looks like Sassumalore. So there was just one Italian family up there, and with all my nouns, I couldn't really talk to them, but I just pointed and said, Sassumalore, Sassumalore, si, signor, si, signor. So that's where we ended up, and I knew what we had done on March 3rd.
Okay, I'm going to back you up again. Going back to Riva Ridge, what was it like watching? Did you watch the rest of the guys go up?
You really couldn't see a thing from the valley. We were down in the chestnut trees, and no, I couldn't see any of the battle. I never really saw a battle from a distance. I was either right at the front or I wasn't there. So I've talked to people. One guy I remember talking to, I think in the hospital, and he was a first scout. And the first scout, of course, was out in front, and then there was usually a second scout, and then maybe some flank scouts, and then the major unit, the platoon or company would come through. And he said this one time he passed through some sort of a pass, good place for an ambush, but he got through, and suddenly the Germans came up on either side of the pass and started shooting at the main body. But he survived because he had already gotten through and was hiding in some trees or in a foxhole or something. But he said it was so unusual to actually see a battle take place, to look behind him and see this battle going on. But I never had that experience. No.
Okay, so after March 3rd, what did you do?
Seems to me it was just take one ridge, settle down for maybe a couple days, take another rid, settle down. Usually after 6 weeks, you'd get 4 days of relief. You'd go back, and one of the times we went back to it must have been a real fancy estate, a big manor house and a lot of outbuildings and olive groves all around. And some of the olive groves, well, they were on terraces, so first we set up pup tents, and for some reason or another, GI food or eating other stuff that we'd found, a lot of the guys had diarrhea. And I remember this, again, this is a gross story. A lot of the guys had diarrhea and they just had it really bad. So we had a slit trench dug a couple little terraces down from where we had our pup tents. So this one guy has to really go. So he goes running down, jumping down these terraces, which are only 4 or 5 feet, ripping his pants down, squatted over the slit trench, did his business, and looked up, and here are 4 or 5 Italian girls picking olives off the olive trees. Yeah, was he embarrassed. Then we moved to what probably was a 4 or 5 car garage, because this was a wealthy family and they probably had a lot of cars before the war. And one of the workers at this estate lived in a little bungalow right next to the garage. And I think the sergeants maybe slept in this bungalow, maybe even in beds, but the enlisted men just bunked out on the floor in the garage. Well, the sergeant set up a deal with the family that they would give them soap and candy bars and maybe bottles of beer, whatever they had, for an Italian meal. And the Italians were good cooks, and everybody, of course, wanted to get a nice Italian meal. But the enlisted men knew nothing of this, so we'd eaten whatever our GI meal was, sea rations possibly. But one of the sergeants came out, I guess it was my squad leader, and he said, they just fed us the wonderful spaghetti and meatballs in there, but they're serving some more food and we can't eat anymore. So you want to go in? And I said, sure, great. I was only 18. I love to eat. So we went in. The second course was the good stuff. It was chicken and noodles in sort of a cream sauce and with white wine. They had had spaghetti and tomato sauce with red wine. So we went in, and I wasn't much of a drinker, but I sipped a little wine, and the chicken and noodles were great. And I thought, the sergeant, with all their planning, blew this one. We got the best meal.
Absolutely. So tell me about getting wounded. Where were you, and what happened when you were wounded?
Oh, okay. That's sort of an interesting story, too. We're in about the first week, or, well, it must have been about April 12th or something like that. And our platoon got the wonderful assignment of going out in the no man's land while they fired artillery over our heads. And then we were to lead the attack. And later on, we all got the Silver Star for doing that, which we weren't terribly brave. We just happened to be selected. But we also were the liaison unit with the Fifth Army, who were to our east, on the east side of the Italian boot. So we had to not only lead the attack, but try to keep contact with the Brits who were on that side of us. And then we didn't jump off on the 12th. I don't know if it was proposed or postponed because President Roosevelt had died, or if it was, I think it was bad weather. I think it was so cloudy the planes weren't going to be able to fly and give us some air cover. So we didn't jump off to the 14th of April, and that's when Bob Dole, who was a second lieutenant with the 10th, replacement officer, he hadn't been to Hale or Swift, where he was wounded rather badly, and you probably know some of that story. But anyway, we jumped off. We did the whole business with the going out under the artillery fire. And a lot of the German army, I think, was sort of realized that the war was probably coming to an end, and they were going to lose because I mean, the Russians were pushing towards Berlin, and the American and British and French armies were attacking through Germany. And of course, we were up into northern Italy already. So there was fighting, and there was shelling, and possibly the worst. But a lot of the troops would give up. You would get 20 feet from their foxhole, and they'd throw down their weapon and throw up their arms and yell, "Comrade," which I think came from the Russian front, because the Russian communists called all their countrymen comrades. And so if you wanted to surrender on the Russian front, German or Russian, you yelled "Comrade." But we just kept moving, and it seemed like every night we would maybe find a foxhole and try to bed down, but about 2 hours of sleep and the word came, "Move up another 3 miles," or something. So it was just go, and we only had a few K rations in our pockets, and that was the little ration that came in the Cracker Jack box. And it was good food, but there wasn't enough of it. and you were supposed to get 3 a day, and I think with 3 a day, maybe you had 12 or 1,500 calories, whereas usually troops were supposed to have 4,000 calories in a day. So we were always hungry and trying to find German food that they'd left behind. Canned tongue, I think, was the favorite that I thought was so good. But anyway, a lot of this sort of stuff, and they left behind booby traps, and we would, usually the scouts would spot the tripwires, and they would yell "booby trap," and we'd either walk around it or step over it. So this went on for 3 days? 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th. Morning of the 17th, I think we had spent the night in a little shed, and there was straw on the floor. So this made a wonderful bed. I mean, we had no blankets with us, just your jacket. So we lay down in the straw, and in the morning, 2 or 3 cows were in there munching on the straw. And being a farm boy, I looked up and saw this cow over me, and I thought, "Oh, breakfast in bed, I'll milk this cow." Well, we didn't get a chance to do that. We had to move on. So eventually we came to this, we were really out of the mountains at that point. We were on grassy slopes. So we went up this one slope, and it was near a town called, starts with an M. I'm not sure of the name now. It's in all the histories. Anyway, we had just stopped just short of the crest, and one of the things you learned was the German artillery was still out there. So everybody started to dig a little foxhole. Well, I got mine about that deep and that wide and that long. Well, that's enough to get down into if you had to. And then the word was, move out. So we moved over the top of the crest. As soon as we went over the top, we could see 2 field guns right in front of us, and they started shooting at us, of course. So about the 3rd shell, I had immediately turned around and started for this foxhole, because it was only 20 feet away. I was going to dive into my foxhole. Well, the 2nd shell, I think, exploded behind me, and I got a chunk of shrapnel in my right buttocks. A flesh wound, basically, but it cut part of the sciatic nerve, and the sciatic nerve controls, of course, your whole leg, and it cut part of that, so I've worn a drop brace or worn boots ever since then, and that keeps my foot from flopping down, because I don't have the muscles in here that pull your foot back up. I can't do that with this foot. The brace holds it up so I don't trip on everything. So I went down. Sergeant Matson, great big tough squad leader, throws me on his shoulder, starts double timing out of the shell fire back over to some, what we call them goat sheds, little rocky goat sheds, and my helmet fell off. And I said, "Sergeant, my helmet fell off." He said, "You won't need it. You're going to the hospital," which was true. So I get back there, and we had 2 medics with our company. And, of course, they had a big pouch of bandages, but they always used your bandage because that way you weren't going to use it again. And you had this little metal bandage, which was a great big pad with 4 tails so they could put it around any part of your body. So they sprinkled my sulfa powder, which was in the same packet, on the wound, slapped the big bandage around, and I don't think it bled much. I don't remember much blood being around. You also had 8 sulfa tablets, so you had to take a lot of water. Otherwise it crystallized in your kidneys and was very bad. So I drank a whole quart of water and had my 8 pills, and one of the medics said, "Here, have another quart." So I drank 2 quarts of water. I don't know where I put it, but I drank 2 quarts of water. And Captain Faust, who was a wonderful captain, really great guy, good officer, just an all-around fine gentleman, came up and said, "Asa, you're just scratched. You'll be back with us in a couple weeks." Well, he didn't know the half of it, of course, but he wanted to set a positive notion to things. Well, the medics carried me back to a little area that was somewhat protected, and they were going to bring ambulances up there and take us back. But we had an artillery officer with us, a spotter, and he and Captain Faust went out a little bit in front of where the unit was and tried to get a compass reading on these guns so they could call in artillery. And they did, but the Germans saw them. We were so close they could see people moving around, so they put a shell right on top of them, killed Captain Faust, and wounded the artillery officer. Not seriously, a couple flesh wounds in his arms. So he comes hobbling back to this marshalling station and said, "They've killed Captain Faust," which was a great blow to me because I really thought he was a wonderful company commander. So I was put in an ambulance, went back. The Germans were shelling the road, shelling the ambulances. They tried to get out on this road. Got back to a field hospital, still had my mountain pants on with the big cargo pockets, and some nurse comes along to get me undressed, ready for surgery, because they wanted to get the shrapnel out. And she kept running into ammunition, which she sort of understood, but then a grenade rolled out, and she thought that was not good. I said, "No, the handle is taped down, the pin is still in, it's perfectly safe. Just give it to some GI and let him take care of it." So I asked the surgeon to save the piece of shrapnel for me. I thought it'd make a great souvenir. I think he would have done it for an officer, but he didn't do it for enlisted men. But have we about run out of time? Because I don't want to go over.
Still okay. Nope, we're okay.
So.
Okay, so tell me about your experiences in the hospital.
Nothing real very special. One interesting conversation. I was right next to a Nisi, a Japanese fellow, and they had 2, what did they call them, regimental combat teams, the 100th and I think the 442nd. Anyway, we're both chatting away, and he said, "We really hate you guys from the 10th. And I thought to myself, what in the world did we ever do to these guys from Hawaii? And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, before you guys got here, we got all the publicity." And they did. They got a lot of special publicity. And he said, "Your PR guys came along and they took over all the publicity, so we hate you guys." I thought that was a little odd. But they tried doing a nerve splice because the nerve that was cut, if you kick this leg back, it gives them some slack, and they could splice those 2 nerves. Well, nowadays, nerve splices are rather routine. But in a small hospital we weren't right on the front, but we were back, but it didn't work. But I've often thought I really had the $1 million wound. People always talked about the $1 million wound. One, you could have swim trunks on and nobody could see your scar. And 2, you could still do things. I mean, you had both arms, you had both legs. And I've done a lot of hiking, a lot of bicycling, led overseas bicycle trips for American Youth Hostels, hiked in the Sierras, did the Chilkoot Trail hike in Yukon Territory, where they went up the Golden Staircase to get to the gold fields. Canoed in Alaska, canoed in Canada, did a lot of stuff with the Boy Scouts. 2 summers on the staff at Philmont Scout Ranch. And one of those summers I would take groups out for 6 weeks in the mountains. Never saw a road or a car for 6 weeks. All the food came in by pack horse. So it was really scouting at its best. And for American Youth Hostels, I worked for them for 11 years as the Western Regional Director. Well, most of the job of a director was just office stuff, coordinating consuls and membership and seeing that the group selected good officers. But I took it a step beyond, and I would actually lead trips, but I called them learning trips. So we would try to hike into new areas or do winter camping, which the local units had not done, canoe trips, kayak trips, raft trips, rock climbing. We did some rock climbing, got a rock climbing group started. So I did all the stuff that I liked to do from early scouting days and from the 10th Mountain days. And just the fact I could do these things just amazed me. I mean, here I was, supposedly badly wounded, but I could do these things. And there was a downside to all of this, because after, I guess, 55 years or something, I used this leg too much and wore out this hip. So I had to have a hip replacement. Well, that weakened this leg even more, so this leg had to do more of my walking and cycling and climbing, so this hip wore out. So now I have 2 new hips, plus the old war wound. So my legs are not in great shape.
Where were you when the war had ended, and what did you feel once you learned the war had ended?
I was in the hospital somewhere around Florence, and we just all felt great. But I happened to be back in my hometown in Illinois on a leave from Army Hospital on VJ Day. And the people square danced in the street and did conga lines, and there was a great lot of hoopla, so I at least got to see that. I was still limping pretty badly and walking with a cane, so I didn't get into the conga lines, but I got to see it at least. So yeah, we were elated. Wonderful.
Okay, I'm going to take you back into the war again. What were your duties in the 86th? I mean, I know you were private, but what did you do?
Oh, most of the time I was just a grunt, a lineman. For a while I was a company runner. So if our platoon wanted to get a message back to company headquarters, which might only be 200 yards to the rear, or it might be a mile to the rear, I was supposed to run the message back. If somebody from Battalion would come up to inspect, I took them around to the various outposts. A lot of times it was a message from one platoon to another, or a message from platoon back to company, or company back to platoon. I had one funny experience at Casodiano. We were in Casodiano twice. I don't know quite how that happened, but we were. And one of our guys liked to drink wine. So when I was running message, he'd say, whenever you see any wine bottles or barrels, if they're wine bottles, bring some back. If they're barrels, smell it and see if it's wine and come and tell me. So I found this great big huge hogshead in somebody's backyard. And I came back and told this fella, I think I found you a whole big thing of wine. So he came back with me and tasted it, and he said, it's vinegar. He was very unhappy. Had another unusual experience. This was, I think, after we had been to Casodiano the first time, and we were right up on the front. Actually, we were in a thumb sticking out from the front. And we were under such intense fire from the Germans, both machine gun and mortar and artillery, that we could only get out our foxholes at night and go back and get some rations and fill a canteen. So it was not a healthy place to be. One fellow, and all the foxholes had been roofed by the units that had been there before us. And one fellow, his roof fell in during the day. He went out to try to repair it and was killed by a German sniper, just almost immediately shot. But being I was the company runner, I also often had the telephones. So the squads would be out here with a telephone back to my bunker, which was only maybe 75 yards behind theirs. But the telephone back to the mortars was laying out on the ground about 15 feet away, because the telephone line had been broken and nobody had ever managed to get another piece of wire to connect it. So I'd get a message from one of the squads. They'd say, there's a German patrol approaching, have the mortars fire, and they would give some coordinates, F42 or G7 or something. So I'd run out and get the other telephone and say, so-and-so wants this coordinate fired. Then I'd run back and get on the line with them and say, where were you? We want a different coordinate fired. I said I had to go out to the other telephone. So it was a dumb situation. But the best thing that happened there was every so often they would have leaves, not the official leave where the whole company would go back, but maybe 4 guys from a company would get to go somewhere. And the lieutenant would always put all the platoon names in the helmet and have somebody pull one out. Well, my name was pulled. So 3 other guys from the company got to go. But we're out on this thumb sticking out, and we have to get back through this thin area of the thumb where the Germans had observation from both sides. So some sergeant, I guess, took us back and said, now when you get to this, and it was daylight. I mean, normally all the supplies came over at night. He said, when we got to that point, he said, everybody stop. Now you run for 100 yards and get over there and then you'll be safe. And then we'd wait some number of minutes. Another person got to run. So I got 4 days in Florence and walked all around Florence, which was just delightful. They had walking tours. They had GI bicycles that you could check out and go cycling around. And the wonderful ancient bridge across the Arno, Ponte, which had all the goldsmith shops on it. And the Germans, although we gave them bad marks in most things, they actually had a feel for history. And they blew up all the other bridges across the Arno. And of course the military threw up Bailey bridges. By the time we were there was all kinds of traffic. But they didn't blow up Ponte because they thought that is too famous. It's hundreds of years old. But they blew up 4 square blocks on both sides of the river. So I checked out this GI bicycle where we were living in the railroad station and rolled it over the rubble, bicycled across Ponte, did the same thing on the other side, and went over to, I think, one of the Medici palaces and looked around at that. So Florence was wonderful. We've been back there various times, but I had a hard time finding the railroad station where we lived. Well, they built a new railroad station, and it's sort of, I don't know, sort of a storage area behind the railroad station, but I finally found it. And that brought back all kinds of memories because they served us just GI food, but those Italian cooks would add a little olive oil, a little garlic, and oh, it was so good. And we slept on beds with sheets. We hadn't seen sheets for months.
Great. Well, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was a nice interview.
Yeah,
I
you did really well. It was really fun.
I think, no, I didn't tell you this story. A fellow from California, he's the son or grandson of a 10th guy, is getting his master's degree in history, and he's doing oral reports from GIs. And I think a lot of the guys either don't want to talk about the war or their memories have faded to the point where they don't know many details. So he sat down with me and he said, oh, we'll talk for about an hour. We talked for 4 hours.
Oh, wow.
He got it all typed up. I think it was 27 pages.
Wow, that's quite an interview. Thank you, though.
No, I enjoy talking. I have lots of crazy stories.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe Carlton Miller will tell this story because he signed up at the same time I signed up for an interview. But a lot of well-to-do families from New England had guys in the 10th because they knew how to ski before the war. And usually you had to be pretty well-to-do to ski before the war because it wasn't a common hobby and it was sort of expensive. So one of the fellows that Carlton knew about became an officer, and he got a leave before we went overseas. Well, he knew the people from Smith & Wesson who manufactured small arms. So he went to see, their sons were always also in the service, but he went to see their fathers. And one of them said to him, why don't you carry one of our 44s in combat? It's got a longer barrel than the American, the GI 45, which had only a 4-inch barrel, and you couldn't hit anything with it. But if you did manage to hit anything, you knocked them over, and that's what they liked. They wanted something that would knock a person down. Anyway, they gave him a revolver, 44, and he carried it in combat, and officers could get away with a lot of things. So, and even our sergeants often carried other weapons. But anyway, his unit gets to the Po. He's a platoon leader, has about 40 men. But a bunch of other units have already crossed the Po on boats. And his unit didn't have any specific orders to cross, but he found some Italian fishermen that had some boats. And being a good officer, he said, we got to attack the enemy. So they got his men in the boats, they got across, no opposition. And on the other side, they thought, well, the enemy has retreated north. So they went a few miles and came upon a village, and the Italians were moving all through the village. So they knew the Germans weren't there, because if the Germans were there, the Italians would be in their basements, because they knew there was going to be fighting, and they didn't want any part of that. So he asked them, where are the Germans? Oh, they're in the next village, a couple miles away. So he takes the whole unit up to the village. They get to the village, nobody's moving. So I thought the Germans are here somewhere. So he and a sergeant and a couple men, they left most of the platoon behind. They started through the village. They finally found a fellow and said, where are the Germans? Oh, they're at the other end of the village, just 100 or so yards away, a little village. And he said, they've got a Tiger tank in the barn, and the troops are around the little patio area in front of the barn, sort of the barnyard. So they move cautiously up. They look around the side of the building. Here are some the German soldiers laying down, most of them even asleep, just laying there in the sunshine. No enemy around, we can sleep. So he rushes out, has the sergeant and the couple soldiers cover the men with their M1s, and he sees the tank, and he starts over towards the tank. Well, a German sergeant starts running towards the tank, probably to activate something and shoot these dumb Americans for attacking their tank. So the guy whips out his Smith & Wesson revolver.
That was Carlton?
Pardon?
Carlton?
Carlton told this story.
Oh, Carlton told the story.
But it wasn't Carlton. No, he wasn't there. But he knew the officer. Anyway, he has his hammer down on an empty chamber, so he has 5 rounds in the revolver. He starts shooting at this German sergeant running towards the tank, hits him 4 times, but he doesn't go down until the 5th shot. So the sergeant finally falls over. He didn't die, but he kept shooting him in the legs. A guy opens the hatch of the tank, a private, and sticks his head out. Well, everybody knew how to tell the Germans to surrender. Put your hands up and come out. So what does he have in his hand? An empty revolver. So he captures a Tiger tank with an empty revolver. Now, it's probably the only time in World War II that happened. That's a funny story.
That's pretty funny.
So if you can